Well, it's good to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Now, dear ones, last time we were together, I had done part one on the Marxist and Islamic attempt to destroy Israel. I'm going to be doing part two next week. And the reason for that is I'm going to be doing a Sunday school on that very topic. And sometimes when I get into controversial things, I like to run things by my congregation. They are very biblically astute. And I also like to run things by my fellow pastor, who's an excellent theologian, probably the best, I think, in the world today, Bob DeWay, who is the author of Critical Issues Commentary, and get feedback from them. So I'm going to do that first, then I'll be sending you that part two on the Marxist Islamic attempt to destroy Israel message next week. Now, after that, I want to get back into pure eschatology. I want to address how the pre-wrath view understands the rapture. So we'll start getting back into the various rapture views. And then shortly after that, I'm going to help you try to interpret and understand the book of Revelation. But today, I've got kind of a special message for you. I've been a little bit annoyed lately in the last few weeks with some of the political things that I see in our world. And I want to talk about kind of the theological implications of them. Now, last week we had a caucus in the United States, and one left wing commentator claimed that evangelical Christians were like Nazis because they supported the nomination of Donald Trump. And I want to address this error that evangelicals, those who really hold to the Bible, are like Nazis. By the way, the term evangelical means euangelion. That's where it comes from in the Greek. It literally means the gospel or the good news. So an evangelical is one who believes in the good news, namely the person and work of Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is over the years, I've heard many times the left claim that evangelicals are like Nazis. What I'm going to show you today is that the true fascists or Nazis in America are really those on the left. And what I'm going to show you is the basic root for fascism and Nazism was actually a deep ecology where people worshiped and served the creation rather than the creator who's forever praised. Creation worship that neo-pagans engage in our culture always leads to fascism. Always. And I'll explain why. Because in essence, the uniqueness of humanity made in the image of God disappears. And so anytime that happens, innocent human beings are going to die. So I'm going to show you that it's not conservative right-wing evangelicals that are the fascists or the Nazis. In fact, it's the left who claim that the conservative Christians are Nazis. They're actually the fascists and the Nazis. So with that, let's begin by talking about a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview is the antidote to fascism. It is. And first, what we must believe is that God exists. When I was an airline pilot for years, I was a flight instructor before that, I used to give a proof for the existence of God that's often tied to what's called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument uses deductive reasoning, which sometimes, if your premises are valid, leads to necessary conclusions. And so I'm going to show you a deductive argument for the four possibilities for the beginning of the universe. And I want to do this with you to begin by proving that yes, God exists. We can know that. And that's the beginning of a coherent worldview that ends up rejecting fascism. Okay, so let's begin with number one. If we look at the beginning of the universe, we can say there's really only four possibilities for its beginning or its existence. And any single category that you'll ever come up with will fall within one of these four. Okay, so let's begin with number one. We can first say, well, perhaps the universe, and what I mean by universe is simply all that exists. We can claim that all that exists is merely an illusion. In other words, it doesn't actually exist at all. In fact, the famous philosopher Rene Descartes, he dealt with that very issue. Remember his very famous, I think, therefore I am? What Rene Descartes was doing is he was engaged in a process whereby he tried to deny the existence of everything. And he started down this path of despair in which he would say, well, how can we know anything at all? Well, finally, Rene Descartes realized that by him doubting something, for example, he doubted existence itself, he was actually doing something. Why? Because doubting is thinking. You're using your mind. What he realized is that if you're doubting, you're doing something, and therefore that led to his very famous saying, I think, therefore I am. In other words, the very thinking process of doubting proved Rene Descartes' existence. Why? Because nothing can't do something. That violates the law of causality. It violates the law of non-contradiction. How can something not exist and then exist at the same time in order to do something? That's an absurdity. Okay, so therefore, what Rene Descartes proved was that yes, he existed. Therefore, let me pull up my pointer. Therefore, something must exist. And if something exists, either it's eternal or it's non-eternal. Okay, so we know that certainly not everything is an illusion. Why? Because if you and I are thinking that it's an illusion, we're doing something, and nothing can do something. Number two, the universe could have self-created itself. What's the problem with that? Well, self-creation is an absurdity because you would have a violation of the law of non-contradiction. When it comes to the laws of logic, whether they be the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction, and I think associated with that, the law of causality, they're immutable. There's no way to get around them. Now, let me just cite the law of non-contradiction related to the second premise. Think about it. If the universe self-created itself, how could it not exist and then at the same time exist to put itself into existence? That's absurd. What the laws of logic do for the human thinker is they are like police officers. I'm going to try to get this, my hand in the frame, that tell you don't go there. You've made an error. Okay, go back to the drawing board. You've made an error. All right, so if you believe that the universe cannot exist at the same time exist to put itself into existence, you're not a rational thinker. Nothing can self-create itself because it violates the law of non-contradiction. So we can get rid of the first two. Let's go to the third option. The universe is eternal. What's the problem with believing that the universe, as Carl Sagan famously said, is all there ever was, all there ever is, and all there ever will be? What's the problem with that? The problem is it violates the second law of thermodynamics. Remember, in the first law of thermodynamics, we understand that you can't have any mass or energy created. You only have the same amount of stuff that is mass or energy in the universe. But in the second law of thermodynamics, we see that this energy is going from a higher organized state to a lesser organized state, meaning it's trending towards decay. And sometimes this law of physics is called the law of entropy. And what it states is that all energy in a closed system is in decay. Well, if that's true, and it's a law of physics, it is true, well, that would mean that you would have to have, remember, they believe, those who hold to it in an eternal universe believe that the universe has always existed. How can you have an eternal universe with a finite supply of usable energy? Think about it. Go back in eternity past. If you only have a finite supply of usable energy, you would be out of it by now because the universe is eternal. It's always existed. So how can you have an eternal existence of a universe with a finite supply of usable energy? If that were true, we wouldn't be talking. We would be out of energy by now. Okay, that's the problem with the third view, is it violates a law of science. So think about the quandary the atheist is in. They must either deny a law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, or the second law of thermodynamics. So they're either denying a law of logic or a law of science. So that leads us to is the fourth possibility, that there is an eternal being who in fact created the universe. And again, what we're claiming is that's exactly what the Bible declares in Genesis 1:1 when it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Notice it does not say, in the beginning God created himself. That would be an absurdity. Why? Because he would have to not exist and exist at the same time to put himself into existence. We would run afoul of premise 2. So the Bible isn't saying that. What the Bible is declaring, just as it says in Psalm 90, that from everlasting to everlasting, olam in the Hebrew, from everlasting, God is the only eternal being. Okay, so what we have in the Bible then is proof that there is an eternal being who creates everything else. So you have a creator who's eternal, and everything else is part of the creation. What I'm going to show you is if you don't have that biblical worldview, you're going to become a pantheist or a pantheist or an atheist, and you're going to trend towards fascism. And I'll show you why. At the end of the day, what atheists do is atheists have to violate two principles, either the law of non-contradiction. Again, they say that the universe can self-create itself, or the second law of thermodynamics. They claim that they can have an eternal universe with a finite supply of usable energy. What I'm saying is nonsense. If you're an atheist, you're irrational. That's all you are. And I say that as a flight instructor, as an airline pilot. I'm telling you, you're irrational. It's like believing in pixie dust. It's like denying gravity. It's like believing the Vikings won 4 Super Bowls. It's that kind of fanciful thinking that ought to be rejected. Okay? All right, now, why is that so important that we start with the fact that God exists? Well, let me go on to talk a little bit more about oneism versus twoism. This clever description, by the way, I have to give credit to my friend and colleague, Pastor Bob DeWay, and he actually learned it from a think tank. And I want to run it by you because I want you to think now we've rejected atheism. I also want us to reject pantheism. Why? Because my claim is atheism and pantheism are really in the some sense the same. Now, why do I say that? Well, you'll understand in a minute. But atheism and pantheism always lead to fascism. Always. You'll never have a coherent biblical worldview that leads to fascism. Okay? So what is oneism versus twoism? All biblical reality is defined by the fact that we have an eternal creator. Okay? Biblical theism suggests that we have a creator who is eternal and non-contingent. Okay? Then you have a creation that is finite. In other words, it's non-eternal, and it's contingent, meaning it's contingent upon the creator for its existence and its sustenance. When we talk about God being non-contingent, what we're saying is he in of himself is eternal, and he needs nothing outside of himself, nor will he ever need anything outside of himself to exist and to continually exist. Sometimes we refer to that in theology as the aseity of God, A-S-E-I-T-Y. The aseity of God has to do with the eternality of God and the fact that he is a non-contingent being. That's biblical theism. Okay, so there's a distinction, therefore, between the creator and the creation. One of the things that I've seen in our culture that is starting to lead towards more fascism is the rise of pantheism and panentheism. Now, as I say this, I'm not claiming that all Hindus or Buddhists, many of whom are nice people, they're all going to be fascist. I'm not claiming that. What I'm telling you is that it's more conducive to fascism, as I will explain. Now, what is pantheism and panentheism? Well, it's oneism. If biblical theism is twoism, you have a creator and a creation. They're distinct. Pantheism, the idea that all, that's the idea of pan. Theism, of course, is God. Everything is God. Or pan-en, by the way, the n there is a dative preposition in the Greek. So all is in God. So either all is God or all is in God, or God is in everything. That's the idea of oneism. And in oneism, there's no distinction between the creator and the creation. Think about in Romans chapter 1, Paul explains that in the end, all idolatry is a worshiping and serving of the creation rather than the creator who's forever praised. So in some sense, what the Apostle Paul is saying in Romans chapter 1 is that all false religions are a form of oneism, where the creator and the creation, there's no distinction. So you might say, well, wait a minute, Eric, what about Islam? Islam is a theistic religion, and that would be true, but why can't we just accept their God? Well, the problem with their God is it is, in fact, a creation of the adherents of the religion. So at the end of the day, it is a God of their own creation, a God who does not exist. Okay, so what I'm getting you to think about is that unless you have a biblical worldview of the God that's revealed in the scriptures, you're going to end up worshiping and serving something in the creation rather than the creator. Okay, now why is pantheism, this oneism, why is that more conducive to fascism? Let me just put my cards on the table right here. Because the belief that we owe an answer to the creator and that we're all going to be judged by him means that we have to live different lives, number one. Okay, if in fact everybody is creator and creation, well, then you decide how you're going to treat others because you are your God. But number two, and more importantly, it's only in biblical theism that human beings are unique in the creation because we've been made in the image of the Creator. In Oneism, because there's no distinction between the Creator and the creation, it's one. Remember, God is in everything. Well, then the sparrow is just as much God as I am. And therefore, there's no distinction in human worth between me and the ant or me and the rocks. Well, maybe you want to boil it down just to things that are actually bio-living. But I would say that, hey, if you're going to be a true pantheist, you believe that God is in everything or is everything, well, then the rocks are God too. So that's this idea of nature worship, where nature becomes as important as human beings. And dear ones, I dare say today, in the radical environmentalism that we see from the degrowth movements and in the left-wing politics, I do dare say that these are people who worship and serve the creation rather than the creator, who view the rest of the earth as more valuable, or at least as valuable, as human beings. And the basic gist is that if you become a complete pantheist, you can start seeing that human beings are in some sense an attack against the rest of the creation or that which exists rather than the essential part of it for which the creation was designed. So the point is, if you reject biblical theism, you lose the uniqueness of human beings made in the image of God. Again, in Oneism, I'm just no more valuable than the sparrow or the rocks that my house is built upon. Why? Because God is in everything. I'm not all that special. So that's the real issue. Now, let me bring up an issue that I see in our culture, and it's been going on, I know, for many, many, many years. That's the issue of yoga. And the reason I'm mentioning yoga is I believe this was a gateway in which a lot of American society became inundated with kind of the pantheistic oneism that I just referred to on the previous slide. Now, as I say this, I know some of you Christians out there, you are engaged in yoga. I would advocate you stop that. But I'm not trying to bash you over this. What I'm trying to show you is yoga really isn't innocent. Now, why? Well, think about yoga. What yoga really is it comes from a Sanskrit term, yoga, which means yoke or union. And the particular yoke or union, and by the way, I'm referring to an online source just to give you the common idea that those who are engaged in yoga hold to. They believe that this union that yoga represents, and again, this is just a generic yoga pro-friendly yoga group online. This isn't some Christian evangelical shoving his idea of what yoga is down your throat. This comes from an online source. It says the union referred to is that of uniting individual consciousness with the divine essence that permeates all things. Now, what do they mean by the divine essence that permeates all things? That's the idea of oneness. The idea that there's no distinction between the creator and the creation, that God is in everything, panentheism, or everything is God, pantheism. That's the idea. So what you have in yoga is the idea of getting your Atman to become one with Brahman. Atman in Hinduism is your individual soul, and they sort of spiritualize that. Your individual identity comes into contact with the oneness of the divinity that is in everything. So you become into contact, as it were, with your own divinity. Why? Because God is in everything. There's no distinction between the creator and the creation. That's what's going on in yoga. That's the union. This essence is perceived when we quiet our five senses and reconnect to the Supreme Self. Again, the Supreme Self, they capitalize because what? Because everything is divine. Yeah, you're divine, but so is the ant that you accidentally step on, or the rat that spreads the disease. Therefore, you can't kill the rat that's spreading the disease in India for years and years. Why? Well, because it's God too. Okay, are you with me? That's the essence of yoga. The idea of yoga is to come in contact with the spiritual realm. And in essence, what they're doing is they're actually yoking themselves, I believe, to demonic beings. Unbeknownst to them, they're trying to contact the oneness of the deity of the universe. Okay, that's the issue. And so think about it, in Hinduism, Buddhism in some sense is an offshoot of it. Atman is your individual self or soul, apart from everything else. Well, your Brahman is the universal consciousness. It's the divine essence running through all things. That's what they believe. That's pantheism. So in yoga, you're really trying to contact or have union between your Atman and your Brahman. That's what you're trying to do. Now, is this, in fact, some benign practice that Christians should engage in? Well, no. Think of it this way. Let me just come up with a clever little question for you. Hopefully it's clever. Let's ask ourselves the question, if yoga is just about exercise, as some Christians claim, let me challenge you, is the Lord's Supper just about dinner? Is the Lord's Supper, should we do the Lord's Supper because after all, it's just about dinner? Could we do that in public schools? I know one of my public schools that my son initially went to, they tried to do yoga for the kids. And so I simply asked, well, can we do the Lord's Supper? If your yoga is just about exercise, hey, the Lord's Supper, well, maybe that's just about dinner. Well, of course, we all know that that's not true. The Lord's Supper isn't just about dinner, is it? No, when we do the Lord's Supper, we're proclaiming what the Lord has done and what he's going to do. Jesus says, as often as you drink the bread or you drink the cup and you eat the bread, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Okay, so my claim is that yoga is a religious exercise designed to get you into contact with your own divinity, making your Atman reach your Brahman. And by definition, it's idolatry. By definition, and it's the Apostle Paul himself who speaks for the Lord Jesus Christ, who said in 1 Corinthians 10:14, flee from idolatry. He says, beloved, my brothers and sisters, flee from idolatry. And he goes on to say, and let me read this, 1 Corinthians 10:21, he says of the Corinthian Christians who are engaging in eating of food sacrificed to idols at the temple, he says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Dear ones, this yoga is designed, in my opinion, by the demonic realm to deceive people into thinking that they are God, that there's no distinction between the creator and the creation. So yoga, by its design, is designed to get you into contact with the demonic realm. Now, the Apostle Paul could have said, let me just reiterate 1 Corinthians 10:21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot do the Lord's Supper and yoga. It's one or the other. Now, by the way, I love exercise. I love bench pressing, squatting, running, all of that stuff. I'm all for it. Hey, you want exercise? Exercise. Stretch, stretch. Do all of that. That's good for you. That's awesome. Even the Apostle Paul says that there is some merit and value in physical training. Do it. It's good for you. But don't do the yoga, because it's the religious element of it that is going to yoke you to demonic beings that you don't want to be yoked with. So no, yoga is not simply innocent. It is something that is designed to be idolatrous and to get you into contact with the oneness of the universe and blur that distinction between the creator and the creation. Why am I mentioning all this? Because this has inundated the United States. Yoga is now more popular than the Lord's Supper in the United States. Why am I saying that? Because what that shows us is that in our culture, we are more comfortable now, and I'm talking about the United States as a whole, it seems to me it's more comfortable with pantheism than it is with biblical theism. When that happens, people end up worshiping and serving the creation rather than the creator. Why? That's why I think you see radical environmentalism absolutely exploding, where the greatest fear that people have is that somehow they are destroying Mother Earth. They are destroying the oneness of the universe, the creation, which they really identify as the creator as well. So that's what I think happened. Now, how do you know God? How should we know God? If we can't know him through yoga, we can't know him as the pagans do, how should we know God? Well, let me give a little bit more worldview issue here. Another big worldview issue is, how do we know God if we don't know him through trying to divine him through the creation? How can we know the God who exists, the creator? Well, in the biblical understanding, and this is what I think is true, is that we have a mediated knowledge of God. Mediated means it's not direct. I don't talk to God like I would with air traffic control. Okay, I don't say, hey, Minneapolis Center, Masaba 334, I need to descent down to 12,000 because of turbulence. And then I hear a reply back. Okay, I don't talk to God in the same way. I think a lot of people think that we go, okay, God, I need help with this, over, and then he replies to us verbally. Okay, no, I pray to him, but I hear God mediated through the scriptures. That's how I understand who God is and what he requires of us. So it's a mediated rather than an immediate uh, connection to God. Okay, so let me give you a passage that would verify this. Deuteronomy 29:29, one of the most important worldview passages for Christians. Deuteronomy 29:29, Moses said this. He said, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our sons forever, that we may observe all the words of the law. Dear ones, notice here in red that the secret things that belong to the Lord alone, those are things that we are not entitled to. Those are things that we try to get through sorcery. Many of you have heard of the occultic practices. Well, the occultic literally means secret things. Okay, so the idea to try to get secret things is where the occult runs. Trying to get things that God has not revealed is an evil practice. But notice the things that he has revealed, that is through his prophets. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we have apostles and prophets, meaning in the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, God has revealed things that belong to us forever. All right. So what you and I want to focus on to know God is to understand who he is cognitively, rationally through the scriptures. Okay, let's contrast that with the pagans that we see in our culture and around the world. What they believe is that they know God immediately, and it's a sensual experience. They get it through their senses, it is through nature or through contact with the demonic realm. Now, this is something that's prohibited in both the Old and the New Testament. In fact, let me show you Deuteronomy 18:10. Listen to what the Lord said to the Israelites. He says, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire. That would be to really, they had a false god that they were worshiping at the time named Moloch. They were trying to satisfy him to get a bumper crop. They would sacrifice their own children. Or he says, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer. Notice the divination, the witchcraft, the omens, and the sorcery. Those are all forms of trying to get the secret thing. Okay, in fact, in Galatians 5:20, one of the deeds of the flesh is sorcery. You know where the term comes from? The Greek term is pharmakeia. It's where we get our term pharmacy. Why? Because people in the ancient world would use drugs in order to put themselves in an induced, altered state of consciousness to contact the demonic realm. Okay, what is yoga designed to do? Yoga is designed to contact you, get you into connection with the demonic realm. It's really a form of sorcery. Okay, so again, a biblical worldview says we know God cognitively, rationally through the scriptures. The rest of the pagan world is saying no, they have immediate knowledge of God and it's through nature. Why? Because God is the nature, or nature is God. It's oneism. There's no distinction between the creator and the creation. Okay, so that all has to be rejected. Why? Well, because we want to be those who please God. We want to be those who know the Lord Jesus Christ. We want to be those who have the forgiveness of sins through faith alone in Christ alone. That's why. But also, I'm going to show you it's because paganism always leads to the death of the innocent. Paganism is what leads to fascism. So, human worth in our worldview. Let's talk about human worth now, and let's distinguish the views of theism and pantheism. First of all, in biblical theism, humans are made in the image of God. We see that in the opening chapters of Genesis, that human beings alone are made as image bearers of God. And this is something that is inherent to who we are. We don't have to try to earn that. Okay, so think of the term human being. Okay, what are you? If you're a human, it describes what kind of being you are. Okay, your being is not something that you have to try to earn. It is inherent to who you are. So every single human being, man, woman, child, infant, baby, born, unborn, they are made in the image of God. And as image bearers of God, we deserve respect. All human beings are image excuse me, all humans are made in the image of God and therefore deserve protection. By the way, this is the reason for the institution of human government. God instituted human government after the flood. And this human government isn't just for the old covenant, it's for all time. For every government that will ever exist until the Lord Jesus returns. And by the way, then the government will be upon his shoulders. Isaiah 9:6. Okay, but notice in Genesis 9:6, that's where God said, if a man shall shed a man's blood, so by man shall his blood be shed. What is that? Well, that's the institution of capital punishment. The whole purpose of God-given government or God-ordained government is to restrain the murder of human beings who are made in his image. And why every single person should love this is because you're a human being. And so it doesn't matter if you're black or white. It doesn't matter if you're Hispanic, Latino, if you're Asian, if you're big, you're small, you're skinny, you're fat. It doesn't matter what you're, if you're a human being, you deserve protection, and no one has the moral right to take your life. And if they do, the consequence is that the government should take the person's life who took yours. And that is to forever be a deterrent against human beings who would murder others. That's the role of human government. And by the way, it's reiterated by the Apostle Paul in Romans 13:4, where he says that the government does not bear the sword in vain, meaning they can use it. So God has ordained government not, as the Marxists believe, to redistribute wealth, but to restrain evil. Okay, unfortunately, when Marxists take over and the fascists come, because they have a one, remember, they either don't believe in God or they believe that everything is God, what they're going to end up doing is distorting the role of government. And they're going to say the role of government is something other than protecting human beings made in the image of God. That's what they're going to do with government. Every time. How many times? Every time they do that. Dear ones, not all human beings, I want to just make this clarification, not all humans are children of God. Only those who believe in Jesus Christ are sons and daughters of God. So listen carefully. Maybe you're an unbeliever out there and you don't believe in Jesus. You still deserve respect. Why? Because you're an image bearer of God. And we as Christians want to respect you. We want to protect you. And we want you to live long and prosperous in the world. We want you to know that. But I also have to have you know, if you're not a believer, that you're not children of God. You're going to hear that everyone's a child of God. It's nonsense. Why? Because the Lord Jesus, the one who walked on water, the one who was bodily raised from the dead, said, no, every single person is a rebel against God, and the only true sons or daughters of God are those who come to faith in him. That's what we see in John chapter 8. Jesus says very forcefully that a slave does not remain in the house forever. What does he mean by that? The slave is those who are slaves to sin. One day they're going to be kicked out of the house. They're going to go to eternal torment. But it's those who come to faith in Christ, who are adopted sons and daughters, who are going to go to heaven. Okay, so what I want you to make the distinction in is between those who are made in the image of God and those who are children of God. Every human being, because you're a human being, you're an image bearer of God. You deserve protection. But only those who come to faith and have forgiveness of sins are children of God, who will in fact enjoy the resurrection and the kingdom forever. Okay, that's a distinction that every Christian should know, and I hopefully the unbelievers who may be watching this, you will know as well. Okay, when I'm showing you this, if you're an unbeliever, is that we as Christians have respect for you and we want you to be protected. Okay, it's very important that you realize that. Okay, now let's talk about the pantheism or panentheism. Remember, biblical theism is the twoism, the distinction between the creator and the creation. Now we have our oneism. Well, since everything is divine or has divinity in it, there is nothing unique about the human being versus the rest of nature. Let me tell you a story. Some years ago, I saw a PETA magazine. PETA is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And they had an article that was entitled, The Holocaust on Your Plate. And what they showed is a picture of a family having a chicken barbecue. Well, because the chicken is every bit as much God as you are, because remember, everything is God, pantheism. Well, therefore, the chicken has as much value as you do. And therefore, what they believe, these pantheists and PETA, is that if you eat the chicken, you're committing a form of genocide. Well, genocide would be human in nature, but you're committing a holocaust on your plate. That's what they called it. So what I'm saying is those people are morally confused because of their pantheism. Dear ones, this is what led in the 21st century now to the radical environmentalism that we're seeing in the United States, where really for the first time we have governments that are being elected that will not allow human beings made in the image of God to subdue the creation in order to use it for their own survival. That's what I'm claiming. That's fascism. In fact, let me give you an example of fascism that's rooted in pantheism that most people don't think about. And I'm going to be citing sources like Mark Musler's excellent book on Nazi ecology. Again, Mark Musler. And there's also another book written by a man named Gene Veith. And I'll give you the title. I forgot the title for just a moment. I'll have it on a following slide. But let me give you an example of pantheism and how it leads to Nazism and fascism. Think about in German Romanticism, in Nazi fascism, God is returned to nature, and there is no distinction between humans and animals. What German Romanticism was the idea that we have to return back to nature because God is in nature, pantheism. If we would get away from this Enlightenment rationalism and get back away from the factories and get away from the city and go back to nature, we would find true utopia, true Shangri-La, our true selves. Okay, that was the idea of German Romanticism, returning God to nature. And so when we approach the 20th century and you start looking at people like Adolf Hitler, the whole purpose of Adolf Hitler's invasion, for example, of the Soviet Union was to create Lebensraum, green living space for the Germanic people. Why? Because they had to get back to nature. So what's interesting is what's fundamental to Nazism is the idea of returning God back to nature. Now, let me give you a name of a man who was probably Adolf Hitler's favorite philosopher. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer did live prior to the Nazi period, but what he taught was fundamental to the Nazi ideology. Now, Arthur Schopenhauer was a Buddhist. He was a rabid pantheist. In fact, he would boast that Buddhism was the highest of all religions. What Arthur Schopenhauer believed is that there must be a return to nature where God is, because God is in nature, God is everything. Remember Oneism, that's pantheism. And unless humanity would do that, we could never have a true utopia. And so men like Arthur Schopenhauer, what they demanded was that everyone would have an allegiance to this idea that God was in nature. And therefore, for example, the animal kingdom had every bit of the same rights as human beings did. Well, what happens in the 20th century is the Germans who hold to this view realize that the Jews will not capitulate to the idea that Genesis chapters 1 through 9 are invalid. So, in essence, the Jews end up being blamed for inventing the God, and I'm saying inventing from the German Nazi perspective. The Nazis criticize the Jews as the ones who invent this theistic God who is distinct from his creation, who demands that human beings are uniquely made in his image and can subdue the rest of creation. And because the Nazis would not reject, or excuse me, because the Jews would not reject that worldview, the Nazis murdered them. That's fundamentally what caused the death and the destruction of the Jews. Now you might say, well, what about the church? Well, many people in the church died as well. Corrie ten Boom, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But at the time in Nazi Germany, there was a movement called neo-orthodoxy that really took the scriptures away from many people. And I don't have time to explain all that, but it basically reduced the church to a bunch of social gospelers, is the best way to put it, where they really weren't true Christians at all. And so they succumbed to this Germanic romantic idea of returning God to nature, but the Jews never did. The Jews would not capitulate on Genesis chapters 1 through 9. Now, as I say that, it's an oversimplification. There were many Germans who were real Christians who also stood against Nazism, and many of them also died. And some of them even died trying to protect Jews. Okay? So, who is really the fascist? The book that I was thinking of was written by a man named Gene Veith. So remember, two books you want to read if you want to understand Nazism. One is Mark Museller's Nazi Ecology. He also wrote a book called Nazi Oaks. It's actually the same book, it's just different titles. So the former title was Nazi Oaks. It became Nazi Ecology. There's another book that was written by a man named Gene Veith called Modern Fascism, and the subtitle is The Threat to the Judeo-Christian Worldview. Now, let me cite from this Gene Veith. Listen to what he says regarding the hatred of the Jews by the Nazis, according to Gene Veith in his book, again called Modern Fascism. Gene Veith says this, he says, quote, this is page 44 and 45 of his book. He says, Jewish monotheism led to the decline of the mythological consciousness in which religion, nature, and the community were unified. Fascism sought to restore the values of primitive cultures with their social solidarity, oneness with nature, and psychic integration. The iconoclasm, let me stop there because some of you may not be familiar with iconoclasm. Iconoclasm comes from two words in the Greek, the term icon, which is where we get our term icon or figure, and klao, which means to break. So iconoclasm is the breaking of idols. And it's often figuratively really applied to people who challenge cherished beliefs or things that are erroneous from false religion. So iconoclasm is the idea of wanting to get rid of idolatry. And that's attributed to the Jews. Why? Because they believed in the God of the Bible. And it should be true of Christians if we believe in the God of the Bible. Okay, that's the idea of iconoclasm. So the iconoclasm, the wanting to destroy the idols, the anti-paganism, of course, why? Because we're not pagans. We believe in the revealed word of God. And the moralism of the Judeo-Christian tradition must be eradicated so that a more holistic spirituality could emerge. That was the basis of Nazism. Now, where do you hear about this idea of holistic spirituality? Well, you hear it from those who want to engage in pantheistic religions today in America, and those who want to engage in deep environmentalism. Okay, think of this Marianne Williamson. She believes in New Age spirituality is what really she believes in. Okay, I have a friend and colleague, Bob DeWay, who's done research into some of her books. And what he would show you is she holds to this very type of holistic spirituality. Well, is she running as a Republican or a Democrat? Well, she's running as a Democrat. Okay, so the fascists are those who are oneists. They return God to nature. It was radical environmentalism that drove the Nazi movement. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, some of the biggest and most profound nature and ecological laws that any nation have ever passed were passed by the Nazis. That's what they're being passed by. Why? Because they wanted to create their Lebensraum, their green living space. Now, tie that idea with Darwinian evolution. That's the other thing that Adolf Hitler believed. Darwinian evolution is anti-biblical. You and I as Christians, if you're watching me and you're a Christian, we believe that all human beings were created. We didn't evolve. Okay? But natural Darwinian evolution is something that Adolf Hitler believed in, and he believed that the Aryan race evolved further than the other race, and therefore they were the ones who were to enjoy the Lebensraum, the green living space. And so that's why he invaded the lesser people, whether it be Czechoslovakia, the Poles, or the Russians. He viewed everyone other than those of the Aryan race to be inferior. Okay, now why am I mentioning that? Well, the road of Nazism, again, is radical environmentalism, returning God to nature, and Darwinian evolution. Both of these are rejected by evangelicals. If that's true, then why is Joy Reid on MSNBC saying that Christians are Nazis? I'll tell you why she's saying that, Joy Reid of MSNBC, because she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's clueless. She has no clue. Joy Behar of ABC The View, she calls Christians Nazis. Why? Because she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's ignorant. Okay, let's ask ourselves the question, who believes in Darwinian evolution? An evangelical or a left-wing professor? Well, the evangelical is one who believes that God is the creator of all things. And we uniquely as human beings are made in the image of God, that we didn't evolve from amoeba to man. Okay, that's Darwinian natural evolution. And by the way, it's called macroevolution in our circle. Okay, so Darwinian evolution, that is the root of Nazism, is believed by the left-wing professor and those of the Democrat Party. What about radical environmentalism? Who is telling you that it's wrong for you to own a gas-guzzling vehicle? Is it Donald Trump or is it someone from the Democrat Party? Well, it's the Democrat Party that's telling you that. Why? Because they return God to nature just as the Nazis and the fascists did. See, I'll show you later, there's a connection between fascism and Marxism. Okay, so again, the evangelical isn't telling you you can't drive your gas guzzling vehicle, or in my case, be a flight instructor who flies aircraft. Okay, I don't think you're sinning if you're burning fossil fuels. All right, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the world is going to get along splendidly. But it's the left-wing professor who says, no, we really have to get back to Lebensraum. Now, they won't actually use that term, but that's what they're trying to do. They want to get back to nature, just like Arthur Schopenhauer, just like Martin Heidegger, just like those of the Nazi Party. That's what I'm claiming. Again, Hillsdale or Harvard. Let's think about it. Hillsdale was really run by a bunch of evangelicals, a bunch of people who are committed to the gospel. Do you see anti-Semitism at Hillsdale, or do you see it at Harvard? Let's ask ourselves the question, just for a moment, where's all the anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews being expressed? And by the way, if anyone is out there and you know of Jewish people, I want them to see this. If you're a Jewish person, we love you. Why? Because you're a human being made in the image of God. And I want to say to you, I want to ask you the question, is the anti-Semitism, is it at Harvard run by the left, or is it Hillsdale run by the evangelical? Well, of course, it's at Harvard, and it's at Stanford, and it's the University of Pennsylvania, and everything else run by the left. Isn't it interesting? That's where all the anti-Semitism is. Why? Because they're the ones who believe in the root of Nazism, radical environmentalism, Darwinian evolution. And so the Jews and the Christians are going to have to die again. That's ultimately the view of those who run the DNC. That's who they are. Okay, that's who they are. That's where it comes from. So just ask yourself the question, Hillsdale or Harvard? Where is the anti-Semitism and therefore the Nazi-like thinking, the hatred of the Jews? Well, it's not coming from the evangelicals. We as evangelicals love all people, but we have a special love for the people of Israel because our faith is rooted in the scriptures that come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is, I should say, the promises that come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, we, as it says in Romans 11, verse 17, the moment we as Gentiles believed in the gospel, we were grafted in to the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so again, we love all people. We have a special affinity and love for Jewish people. Why in the world would we be those who are the Nazis? Okay, no, it's those who return God to nature, like the Nazis and those who believed in Darwinian evolution. That's not me as an evangelical. Okay, we have to get a brain out there, and I'm not talking to my brothers and sisters. I know you get this. But for those that are out there listening to Joy Reid, Joyce Behar, and those who are saying that evangelicals are Nazis, it's not true. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay, all right, so who's the real fascist? Well, isn't it interesting? The term fascism in Latin actually comes from fascis, and in Italian it's fascio, which means to bundle. Okay, it means to bundle. Now, why would it mean bundle, and why is that important? What fascism is ultimately is Mussolini's attempt to rescue Marxism from identifying only with with identifying only with class. So remember, in true Marxism, Marx sees the divide between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the haves, the proletariat are the have-nots. So in Marxism, there's supposed to be this constant divide between the haves and the have-nots. And in fact, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, Marx really advocates that there shouldn't be a distinction that people make if you're part of the proletariat between different national identities. In other words, national identity is no good. You can't have national borders, national identity, because then you'll start thinking as an American or a German or a Canadian or whatever you may be, rather than the oppressed as part of the proletariat. So what happens is Mussolini realizes that's a loser idea, because he says people most often divide not between class, but often around national identity. So this is the rise of National Socialism. That's exactly why Adolf Hitler adopted it. So Adolf Hitler and Mussolini have a National Socialism, where it's a form of Marxism, but they realize national identity is important. Now, today, people on the left will say Donald Trump is a fascist because he's a nationalist. That's not true. Just because you're a nationalist does not mean you're a fascist. Why? Think about Gandhi was a nationalist. Mandela was a nationalist. Is someone willing to say that Gandhi was a fascist or Mandela was a fascist? Okay, so nationalism in and of itself does not lead to fascism. What leads to fascism is the idea, at least in Mussolini's case, of wanting to bundle the power of corporations to help the state subdue the masses. Let me say that again. Practically, how this works is fascism is communism that bundles the power of large corporations who help the state subdue the masses. By the way, who was it? Just curiously, everyone can think about this themselves. Who wasn't just recently that wanted the help of the tech corporations to subdue the masses by regulating their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, YouTube accounts, etc., their Google, etc. What was all this corroboration between the big tech companies and the government? Well, that wasn't something that the conservatives wanted. That's something those on the left wanted. Well, that's the exact thing that Mussolini wanted, was to bundle the power of big corporations against the masses. Think about the original fascist was Mussolini, who took control of Italy in 1922. And what's interesting is when he did so, the first thing that he did is he bundled the power of the corporations to be used against the masses. Why? Because the masses don't matter. He sees not individuals made in the image of God, but he sees everything through the power structure of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And yes, he just adds to that the national identity. That's who he was. Okay, think about this. Let's ask ourselves some questions here that I have on the screen. If I can get them to come up here, there we go. If fascism and Nazism were built upon the superior race theories, which party today wants race to be of vital importance? Which party in America wants to see everything through a racial lens? Okay, is it the conservatives? Is it the evangelicals? No. Notice I have Galatians 3:28 there. No, Galatians 3:28 says there's no slave nor free, nor Jew nor Gentile, nor male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. In Galatians 3:28, you have the biblical conception of race, class, gender. And at the end of the day, they don't matter. What pleases God is faith alone in Jesus Christ alone. It doesn't matter how wealthy or poor you are. It doesn't matter what country you come from, and it doesn't matter what gender you are. But in Marxism, they want to divide all of us because the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the battle of the classes, wasn't working. So let's break people down according to their race and also their gender. That's the goal of the Marxist. It's anti-biblical. Okay, but exactly what fascists did. Hey, what did Adolf Hitler believe? He believed in a superior race. In biblical Christianity, race doesn't matter one bit. There's no slave nor free, nor Jew nor Gentile, nor male nor female. All are one in Christ Jesus. Let's ask ourselves another question. Which party in America wants sweeping gun confiscation like Mussolini did when he enacted sweeping gun confiscation laws in 1931? Mussolini, the original fascist, enacted sweeping gun confiscation. Why? Because guns in the hands of individuals could be a threat to his power. And by the way, isn't it interesting that what the Bible teaches is not that you and I can't defend ourselves, but that you and I shouldn't seek vengeance. Okay, so let me read some things to you. I have in my notes. I'm going to read to you from a man. His name is Nikolai Shevchenko, and he writes a column called Russia Beyond. And listen to what he wrote. It's very insightful. He says, how Russians lost their Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. He said, in Tsarist Russia, people love guns, they own guns. Officers, merchants, students, respectable dames, and young ladies all had a favorite handgun, sometimes more than one. However, by the end of the 1917 Bolshevik, that is the communist Marxist revolution, the authorities had restricted the right to carry firearms. Guess what? The fascist Mussolini did the same thing. Now, who in our nation is for restricting you owning a firearm, and who wants to allow you to have a firearm? Well, the conservatives, especially the evangelicals, we think that the Second Amendment means just what it says, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Why? Because you and I are image bearers of God, and we can defend ourselves. Many people will cite Matthew 5:39 incorrectly. They'll say, hey, wait a minute, Eric, Christians don't have the right to defend themselves. Oh, yes, we do. They will cite Matthew 5:39, and they will say, the Lord Jesus says this. He said, do not resist the evil one, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Realize, dear ones, Matthew 5:39 about turning the other cheek, listen carefully. It's not a passage about assault, but it's a passage about insult. The only way that you can be hit on your right cheek with the right hand, which is normally seen as the hand of power, is through a backhanded movement. What's envisioned by Matthew, and therefore Jesus, is the idea of being backhanded and insulted, not physically assaulted. So again, Matthew 5:39, the turning the other cheek, is not about a physical assault. It is about an insult. And the idea then is Christians are not to be those who go tit for tat. You insult me, I insult you. You say something mean about my wife, I say something like your mother wears combat boots or something. No, we're not that kind of people. Why? Because we're merciful. Vengeance is all ultimately the Lord's. In fact, let me read you another verse. Think about this. Romans 12:18 through 19. Paul says this. He says, if it possible, he says, so far as it depends upon you, be peaceable with all men. Okay, and he says, never take vengeance on your own, but leave room for the wrath of God. All right, so here's the point. In Romans 12:8 through 9, he says, as much as possible as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all men. Well, notice he says, as much as it depends on you. Sometimes we can't control what other people do. We have the right to self-defense, but as much as it depends upon us as Christians, we're not going to start anything. We're not going to go around and try to harm people. We're called to love our enemies and to even pray for them. All right. But at the same time, dear ones, we are the ones who understand biblically that because human beings are made in the image of God, human beings have the right to protect themselves. And the government's role is to protect human beings made in the image of God. No, dear ones, we are not the fascists. As evangelical Christians, we are not the Nazis. Okay, let's continue on for the sake of time. Who stands for innocent human beings? Think about the 18th and 19th century. Evil people claimed blacks weren't truly human. Evil people said that. They said black people aren't really human. We can trade them. We can treat them as slaves. Then there was decent people who fought back, claiming all people are made in the image of God, mainly Christians and Jews. Why? Because they believe that there's a creator who created human beings, whatever their race, in his image. By the way, there was a man named Granville Sharp, and when I learned Greek in seminary, all Greek students do when they're seminarians, Granville Sharp has a rule in our Greek grammar that we learn from, and I won't get into it, but this Granville Sharp was a man who taught himself biblical Greek in order to be a better student of the scriptures, in order to fight against the slave trade. This was an evangelical Bible believer who taught himself Greek so that he could be a better defender of the truth and try to eradicate the slave trade. Okay, that doesn't sound like a Nazi to me, or a fascist, or a racist. All right, that's who the decent people were. Again, evil people said blacks weren't truly human. Decent people said that's not true. These are human beings made in the image of God. Think about the 20th century. You had evil people claim that Jews weren't truly human. That is the Nazis. Decent people fought back, claiming all people are made in the image of God. Think about Corrie ten Boom. She was a Christian who hid Jews from the Nazis. And she ended up being put in a concentration camp herself because, in fact, she was a Christian hiding Jews. Okay? Why am I laboring this? Well, think about it. The 20th into the 21st century, you have evil people claim the unborn aren't truly human. Okay? And there's decent people fighting back, claiming all people are made in the image of God. Notice this, 18th, 19th century, evil people claim blacks weren't human. 20th century, evil people claim Jews weren't human. Now you have evil people claiming the unborn aren't truly human. In each case, you have decent people who fought back saying, no, these people are made in the image of God. Okay? Who is for the murder of the unborn? Quote unquote abortion rights. The evangelical or those who return God to nature, the people on the left? Well, it's the people on the left. Well, it's funny. The people on the left who think we can murder the unborn have a lot in common with those who claim the Jews weren't human and the blacks weren't truly human. Does everyone see a very strong parallel and pattern develop? Well, I do. Okay, so again, who is the one who thinks like the Nazi and the fascist? Well, it isn't the evangelical, and it's not the Bible-believing Jew. The Judeo-Christian ethic is that which delivers the world from Nazism and from radical type of murderous ideologies that you see in fascist and Marxist societies. Okay, all right, now let's keep moving. I'm going to get to the unborn here. The unborn exist, and I want to show you this. I want you to think about the unborn for just a moment. The unborn exist, and why I say that is because think about it, they have beings. We all talk about human beings. Do the unborn exist? Yes, they have being. What are the unborn? Well, according to the law of biogenesis, they're human. The law of biogenesis says different animals have this same animal. In other words, dogs beget dogs, cat begets cats, squirrels have squirrels. You don't have a squirrel give birth to a goldfish. Okay, so a human baby is human and they have being. Do they exist? Yes, they have being. What kind of being are they? Well, they're human. Okay, if they're a human being, then why are those on the left saying you can kill them? They said the same thing about black people, and they said the same thing about the Jews. What I'm saying is those who stood with black people and those who stood with the Jews and said, no, these are human beings made in the image of God and they deserve full protection, they are the same type of people that now stand for the unborn and say you ought not to hurt them in any way because they're made in the image of God. If you jettison God, you always murder the innocent, whether it's blacks, whether it's Jews, whether it's any other minority, or whether it's the unborn. That's what happens with those who reject God and the Creator as judge. Okay, it always happens. Think about this: abortion rights, irrational and evil. Fallacies of distraction. You often hear people argue various points around regarding abortion rights, but they're always irrational. Notice it says one of the arguments is you can't tell me what I can do with my body. Well, I'm not telling you what you can do with your body. I'm telling you what you can't do with someone else's body. Okay, notice they conveniently leave out that they're murdering someone made in the image of God. That's the core issue. The core issue in the abortion debate is what the unborn is. That's all you have to argue about. Any other discussion other than what the unborn is irrational. It's a distraction. Let me illustrate this through a story. There was a man years ago I heard named Scott Klusendorf. He gave this example. Think about you're doing dishes, and behind you you have a 4-year-old playing with his 2-year-old sister, and the 4-year-old says, "Dad, can I kill it?" Now at that moment you don't know if the 4-year-old's talking about an aunt or his sister. So at that moment, all that matters is what is it? What is it that you want to kill? If it's an aunt, yes. If it's your sister, no. That question is the only question that matters in the abortion debate. Everything else is irrational. The only thing that matters is the unborn human. Everything else is distraction. What about my rights? You don't have the right to murder a human being made in the image of God. Genesis 9:6, Romans 13:4. You don't have the right. Thou shalt not murder. All right, you see that in Exodus chapter 20. All right? You don't have the right to murder. So people will say, well, women will argue men can't tell women what to do with their body. We're not telling you what you can do with your body. We're telling you that you can't murder another human being's body. The whole issue is what is the unborn. And what I am declaring to you is that the unborn are obviously human. Okay, that's all that matters. The government, they'll say, can't tell a woman what they can do with her body. They tell us all the time what we can do with our bodies. Can I take my body and assault someone on the street? No, they'll arrest me for assault. They're telling me what I can do with my body. Can I take my body and use it to get in a car and drive 130 miles an hour? No, they will tell me that I can't do that with my body. So the government can tell us all sorts of things that we can do in order to protect other human beings made in the image of God. Dear ones, at the end of the day, what matters in the abortion debate is what are the unborn. If they're not human, you can do anything you want to them. But if they are human, then those who are killing them are doing the same thing that those who murdered blacks and Jews. They're the same type of people that we have fought against over the centuries. They are murderous, murderous people. And so what I'm going to show you is logically the unborn are human. The only way that the unborn differ from the born are in size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. I use the acronym SLED. The only way the unborn differ from you and I outside of the womb is in this arena, these 4 criteria. So let's take size. And again, I borrowed from a man named Scott Klusendorf, a great pro-life arguer. He says, hey, let's take size. Should size determine whether one's human? If we're going to go down that road, if you're saying that the unborn are less than human because they're smaller, let's take that to its logical conclusion. If I'm 220 pounds, am I more human than a 110-pound woman? Well, of course not. Of course I'm not. Okay, so we don't determine human worth by size. We never have, we never will. We should. Okay, so size doesn't determine whether one is human. Let's get rid of that. Well, someone might argue, well, wait a minute, the unborn, they're not as developed as we are outside the womb. Well, that's true, but should level of development determine whether one is human? If we're going to go down that road, is a 3-year-old outside of the womb less human than a 21-year-old? Can we kill the 3-year-old? Should we start advocating that? Well, of course, that's absurd, but they have less development than a 21-year-old. So of course it's absurd. Of course the level of development shouldn't determine whether one's human. Size shouldn't determine whether one's human. Level of development shouldn't determine whether one's human. How about an environment? Some people argue that you can murder the unborn because they're in a different environment. They're in the womb. Well, how is it that where you are defines who you are? Do you become less human anywhere on the planet? Well, of course you don't. Of course you don't. That's absurd. So the environment doesn't determine whether you're human. Okay, size doesn't, level of development doesn't, environment, where you are doesn't determine whether you're human. What about degree of dependency? Some people will say, well, the unborn aren't as human because they're so dependent. You know what? I'm dependent upon farmers to grow food. Many of you are as well. Are we going to say to people who are dependent upon, for example, pharmacies for their medication, are they less human? Should we kill people off who are dependent upon various drugs or maybe a wheelchair to get around? Or how about a 7-year-old who can't fend for himself or herself? Are they less human than their parents? Of course not. So when we look at the size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, the only ways in which the unborn differ from the born, these criteria in no way should determine that they're less than human. What's obvious is that the unborn are human beings made in the image of God. And just as the fascists of long ago wanted to murder the blacks because they weren't determined to be human, and the Jews because they weren't determined to be human, fascists today want to murder human beings made in the image of God because that's what fascists do. But let it be known to Joy Reid of MSNBC and Joy Behar of ABC and all those who falsely claim that evangelicals are the Nazis and the fascists, it's not us, it's you. It's not us, it's you. You own it. You need to repent You need to turn to the Lord Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins, and he will give it to you. And you can be forgiven, and you can have everlasting life. But if you persist, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who's the creator of all things, one day he will judge you when you breathe your last. No, dear ones, it's not the evangelical that's the fascist. It's those who hate us. We'll see you next time at End Times with Pastor Eric.